Hey, everybody, welcome back to the news. Thank you for rating and reviewing us on iTunes. Thank you for supporting us at patreon.com/Matt Lewis. And excited to welcome back Victor Davis Hanson back to the podcast. He's a senior fellow in military history at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, the author of many best-selling books, including this brand new book, The Dying Citizen: How Progressive Elites, Tribalism, and Globalization Are Destroying the Idea of America. Victor Davis Hanson, welcome back to the news.
Thank you for having me.
Well, let's talk. I'm really intrigued by the idea of citizenship and of finding ways that we can try to make America strong again,
Yeah,
and make people feel like they're part of the country who are here, our citizens.
yeah, yeah,
But talk about just the concept of citizenship. What
yeah.
is this thing?
Well, it's very rare. I think we have the impression that's the natural order of things, but civilization is 7,000 years old, and citizenship's only been with us for 2,500 years. It was discovered in Greece in the early 8th century, and it's the idea that residents of a confined or a particular place, a city, state, a republic, a nation, an empire, whatever term we use, they select their own officials through voting and they hold them accountable. They make their own budgets. They decide on revenues and taxations, when or when not to make war and peace. They often, as early as Sparta, have a tripartite system of government, legislative, judicial, executive. They protect property, and that's probably where citizenship came from, the idea that if you had a vineyard or an orchard, a lot of capital invested, you had the right to pass it on to your children. And you needed legal protection rather than the whims or the mercurial attitudes of a particular tyrant or king. So that, and it's not been consistent throughout the centuries. It comes, it goes. We lose it in Roman Empire. It comes back in the Renaissance republics. It has a checkered history in the 20th century, as we know from the two wars in Europe. And right now, there's about 190 officially recognized nations, and the minority of them, probably about 90, have some type of constitutional system, which we think is synonymous with citizenship. Civilization, citizenship, that all comes from that Latin word kiwi, citizen. And I don't think of the 90, when you look at them very carefully, very many of them were truly consensual. So my point is, in the past and in the present, it's a very hard thing to do, to turn over governance to the people themselves. It takes a lot of time and responsibility.
It's a precious thing that we have here. I think that, liberal democracy, Western civilization, what we have is very precious, and keeping it requires a bunch of things going right, including, I would say, keeping the people who are citizens happy and engaged and on top of, being caretakers. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would. And so what I did is I tried to go back and look at actual places in history at the beginning, especially Greece and Rome, but also during the Enlightenment or the Renaissance, and then what philosophers and political observers said about it. And I came up with two or three, I would call them pre-civilizational, but natural impulses that had to be channeled toward the advantages of citizenship. One was, you have to have a middle class, that it has to be broad and it has to be autonomous or empowered. And they were pretty blunt about that, Aristotle or Tocqueville, or even Machiavellian people. And they said, the rich will always try to influence government for their own particular agendas, and the middle class will be a check on them, but there'll also be a check on the subsidized poor who will look toward government for total dependency or to the rich. And it has to be economically viable. And so when you look at the United States and see wages stagnating under both Republicans and Democrats until 2017, and now they are again, it's pretty worrisome when you look at a $1.7 trillion in aggregate student debt, or that most people die with less than $10,000, most people than 50% of median worth, and the ages that people, if they choose to get married or have children or buy a house, they're all being delayed in sort of what Tocqueville called prolonged adolescence. So that I was worried about that. The second thing is that most people talk about a confined space. So when you look at Greece or the Italian city-states, people fought wars over pretty worthless ground, and they were usually the powder kegs of war. They were borderlands. And the idea was, even though they're not fertile or they're not minly rich, they represent limitations. Even that word limitations, or Roman word limes, it means the end or the border. And the idea was that they were not able materially, psychologically, spiritually to just have people come in and out, because it was such a rare, fragile idea. They had to inculcate customs and traditions. Translated to our experience, it meant that we're a multi-ethnic, multiracial society, and we have to create an artificial identity. And that is an American identity that transcends our superficial appearances. So whether it's the Gettysburg Address or Martin Luther King's letter from the Birmingham jail or the 4th of July or 1770, we have to have an area where everybody's on the same page. And when you have an open border or no borders, and we have about 45 million people, legal and not, that weren't born in the United States. 27% of the population of California was not born in the U.S. So that is an enormous challenge to assimilate, intermarry, and integrate everybody. But when either you come illegally, or you come from an impoverished area, or you don't have a high school diploma, or the host themselves do not believe any longer in the melting pot, then it makes it very difficult. And so that is a pre-civilizational challenge, as is the third one was tribalism, or the idea that you identify by your natural appearance or your kindred religion rather than some kind of common identity, civic identity. And that seems to be re-emerging in a way that I think most people were very surprised about the last 3 or 4 years.
All right. So middle class,
Yes.
immigration, and tribalism. Let's talk about
Yeah.
Let's go. I want to talk about all three. Let's
Yeah.
start with the middle class. So it sounds to me like if you wanted to preserve a civilization or a society, you ought to have an interest in a strong middle class and
Yes.
preserving that and incentivizing that. And even if you didn't need it necessarily for, I don't know, for other reasons, like let's say, that the stock market might go up with
Yeah.
or without it. It's irrelevant to that, let's say, theoretically, that you would want to foster a strong middle class. And I'm guessing throughout most of our history, we did that. But when did that start to change? Is it globalization? What was the shift?
It's partly globalization. And I think in the last 30 years, we started with the assumption that globalization was a synonym for maybe Westernization in general, maybe Americanization in particular of the economy. So it was a wonderful thing if you were in Mongolia and suddenly you could, have antibiotics, or you were in Bolivia and you got eyeglasses up in the Andes. But the next step was, given the technological revolution, when you could communicate instantaneously. You and I can call tomorrow Nigeria, or we can, this podcast, you can get a reader in Taiwan that'll comment on it. So we were interconnected. Then the next thing was that we were sort of going to have world governance. When we saw that with Secretary Blinken thought that the UN should adjudicate whether we were going to be racist or not. But more importantly, in globalization, people that had particular globalized skills did very well. What we're doing now can we have an audience that will transcend California where you are. And law and universities on the coast became universal in the sense of intercontinental, and finance and corporate. And the blue states, I shouldn't say they're not even blue states. I'm in California, but I'm in a red area in the interior. But from Seattle to La Jolla, let's say arbitrarily, or Washington to Boston, we created enormous amounts of wealth. And then in the interior, sometimes within 50 miles, people whose skills were muscular, traditional, they were mining, timber, small farming, manufacturing, assembly, they were Xeroxed, offshored, or outsourced. So a lot of the produce you see in the store comes from different countries. A lot of the wood is imported. A lot of the steel is imported. And we kind of confused cause and effect. We said well, the red Youngstown, Ohio, or Selma, California, or Fresno, they're really looking bad. It's because everybody's on meth or they are dysfunctional, when in fact the jobs simply either disappear or no longer paid what they did. It was a phenomenon of both Democrats and Republicans, that the Republicans said, our God is free market capitalism and creative destruction. We know that that works, but the problem is they were not worried about the wreckage that made us more efficient, more productive. So, and then I think the left said, well, the interior traditionally is always a conservative place. It's not near the coast. It's not cosmopolitan. And so they kind of got what they deserve. They're just, we can't go in there and worry about those people. They're dregs or they're deplorables. And so we wrote that off. Part of it also was the post-war era. We took enormous subsidies taken for granted. By that, I mean, we were the only country that emerged from World War II intact. Britain had been bombed. Continental Europe had been bombed. The Soviet Union was wrecked. China was wrecked. Germany and Japan were wrecked. So for at least a decade, we supplied all of these countries with their needs. And then when they started to reboot in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, we took enormous trade deficits as part of the new world order responsibility. But I don't think we ever got out of that mood. So a lot of the people on the right, for example, said it's free trade, but they didn't really care whether it was fair or symmetrical.
Yeah.
And so that hurt people who worked with their hands, and that was traditionally in the middle class. There were other things, but that's one of the two or three crucial elements.
So it sounds to me like you're saying this part, the middle class part, was not a conspiracy, but it was the product of, and in fact, people who were pro, free trade, globalization, from an economic standpoint, had a point, right? More efficient. You can get better, cheaper consumer goods that benefit all Americans, buying lower priced products. And also you're spreading the wealth, helping poor people in other parts of the world, which is kind of a philanthropic thing to do.
Mhm.
But I think what you're saying is at the end of the day, even with all those things, really the most important thing that you ought to be concerned about if you are a country is making sure you have a strong middle class. And even if all these other things are great, if it erodes at the strong middle class, eventually it's going to chip away at citizenship. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so. I'm not trying to say that there was an identifiable victim. It's more of an incremental, insidious process. And it was almost like an enticement because materially, by any abject metric, we're wealthier and technologically we're more sophisticated and life is easier. But in the process, we have wiped out entire communities. I'm looking at the house I'm born in, and this checkerboard around me used to have, over there was a Mexican American family, over there was a Greek American, over there was a Japanese American. It was a natural diversity. Everybody had 40 to 80 acres. And the result was that they were autonomous middle class. And we had a very viable PTA, Selma Hospital Board, wonderful emergency room, Little League that was really, and then what happened was because of these forces we talked about, all of this that I'm looking at is farmed by one person. It's about a 12,000 acre almond conglomerate, and they either lease or bought. And the farmhouses that I see are all rented out to people who were mostly here illegally from Mexico. So we have a very subsidized poor class, and then a very few very wealthy people. But when you get rid of this middle group, and I'm just looking at the agricultural sector, the same to small business in town. We had manufacturing assembly plants that are gone. Then you don't have these people participating in civic activities. And then we don't have people on the same page as far as I could go to any one of these houses and not one person can tell me what the 4th of July was about.
Wow.
I'm not even sure the corporate person that owns it can.
Now, I mean, some of these things would come from innovation. There's creative destruction that's just new inventions disrupt.
They do.
Is this a different animal, though, than that?
Yeah, I think two things have happened. One is this technology is a little bit different than the past, and that we have instant and intrusive communications. So you can really, it's an accelerant. Human nature doesn't change, but it just accelerates it. The second is we have never seen in the history of civilization this amount of wealth created in so few hands. I mean, we're not talking about the Fortune 400 30 years ago, where if you had 500 million, you were a timber magnate or a steel magnate or a shipping magnate. We're talking about high finance tech of 50, 60, 80 billion. I think you have to have 3 billion to get on it. So that meant that government looked toward that group of people that had always been suspect. And so I think the amount of wealth and the technology was, and then we had a radical shift in parties. I think that what happened, the left, especially in the tech sector and the media sector, went to the right and said, you guys are free marketers, you're Milton Friedman people. We're the descendants of Carnegie and Rockefeller, and you should want this free market. Just leave us alone. Let us, if we're Facebook, let us control 70% of the social media. We're Google, 90% of the market. That's what we do. And then they went to the left and said, you guys are sort of the party of the very wealthy now. If you look at blue counties, they're mostly Democratic. If you look at congressional districts and you look at per capita income, the highest go Democratic. So you've shifted into a party of the very wealthy and the very poor. And so they played both sides, and we let these people get enormous amounts of wealth. And I think one of the artifacts that we didn't anticipate is they felt, you know what, we can get along. And California is what I mentioned, I focused on in one chapter. We can get along without a middle class. If 9 million people leave, who cares? We've got so much money that we can subsidize the poor. And the result is 1/3 of the welfare recipients in the United States are here. 21% of the people live below the poverty line. We have the worst coefficient of the Gini coefficient, except for Mississippi. And we have the highest number of affluent people in the United States. But it's a feudal medieval society. If you look at,
Yeah. Which you would assume that liberals or progressives would not want,
you'd
right?
think,
Ostensibly, they would not like that situation.
I think what happened though, about 20 million of them on the coastal strip, and we're talking about Facebook, Google, Apple, Stanford University, UC Berkeley, all of the intellectual capital nexus there. They felt they had transcended daily challenges of food or shelter, and they worried about global warming and transgenderism, all these issues, and they were not connected to the interior of the state. And so we have 27 cents a kilowatt for electricity. So where I live, when it gets hot, people go to Walmart. Poor Mexican American people do, to get free air conditioning when it gets 108. But on the coast, it's 65 degrees, 70 all year round. Or when they get water, they get Hetch Hetchy water, and it's exempt from throwing it out in the Delta. Here, they interrupted reservoir water and let it go out to the ocean because it was somebody else's. So same thing about natural gas or timber, or letting 60 million trees be unharvested because of some theory about a new theory of forest management. But the result was people's air was unbreathable when they went up in smoke. So there's a sense that this elite kind of patronizes the poor, but I don't know whether it's because the middle class lacks the romance of the distant poor or it lacks the culture of the wealthy, but they really don't like the middle class. And about 8 to 10 million people over the last 40 years have left California of that class.
So we've got the middle class. Let's go to immigration. I'll just tell you my personal take on it.
Yeah.
I'm very pro-immigration.
I am too, if it's legal.
Yeah, I think America should be like a beacon of hope and welcoming people in, and I think it has this whole diversity of strength thing, but there's some truth to it. By the same token, obviously there is a point at which, what number is too much, right? There has to be a point at which America cannot assimilate new immigrants. And so that's kind of where I'm at on it, is like, I think that I like the idea, but I think that even if I'm okay with it, if a lot of Americans aren't, then that's a problem, right? So if folks in middle America, I live in West Virginia, so I guess that's me. But if a lot of people in middle America it's making them uneasy, they feel displaced, that's a problem, and we need to take that into consideration because they're citizens. What do you think?
Well, you articulated, I think, what 60% of the people consistently poll. And they poll when asked questions by the Pew International or Pew American poll. They say the following, that they support legal immigration. They do not, by a vast margin, support illegal immigration. they support the idea that we take in more immigrants than all the countries in the world put together, if you don't count sort of indentured servants that go to Saudi Arabia or something. So we're the most open country in the world. And they also understand that if we're going to have a legal immigration policy, and we're going to predicate it either on proximity of the border or on certain ideological concerns like family reunification is one, that's fine. But immigration in our past has worked when it was measured in the sense of what you said. People could be assimilated and integrated. People had some modicum of skills. They might have been a stonemason without a high school diploma, but they came here with the idea that they would not be wards of the state. They were diverse. They came from all over the world, and they came legally. And so when you have people who are not coming legally, largely from south of the border, without high school diplomas, I think 80%, it makes it enormously hard to assimilate them. And so the question we have is, we're going to have 2 million people cross the border this year in the fiscal year. I think that's already happened in the actual year of 2021. The question is, why are we doing this? And it seems to be right now that it used to be Republicans wanted the border open for cheap labor. And that wing of the Republican Party, when Jeb Bush said in 2016 that it was an act of love, even though it was illegal. Okay, so I think now people caught on to what Republicans wanted out of it, and they were very meek and tame. They're not so overt about it. But the left, I think, feels that, even though they're very defensive about it, that as California and Colorado and Nevada and New Mexico and perhaps maybe Arizona, Georgia, and Texas will turn blue, that it was a long-term strategy. And then, as I mentioned in the book, it's very hard to distinguish a resident from a citizen legally now, because in the old days, there were certain things that made a legal resident, not to mention illegal resident, much different. They both now can serve in the military. They're both eligible for all the entitlements. These are all done by court decisions. You can go back and forth across the border. That was the big thing that separated, after World War I, a citizen from a non-citizen. They had to have a new idea called a passport. I think you could say the people that in California, they want to go back and forth. If you don't want to do it legally, you can do it illegal. It might cost you a little bit. That's different in a way that a citizen is kind of arrested if he arrives at LAX without a passport. He's detained. Vaccinations, you see it. These 2 million people are not being vaccinated. And yet, if you're a soldier or a federal employee and you've had a bad case of COVID, you have antibodies, you say, I don't want the vaccination, you will be discharged or fired, apparently. So all I can see the difference is that it's down to two things: that somebody here illegally, or who is here illegally, can't hold office. Still, I don't think they can, and they can't vote. Although in California, I think it's Massachusetts now, we're allowing people here who are not citizens to vote in school board elections and local elections. If you look at Stanford Law Review or Harvard Law Review, I think you can make the argument that's a staple of law review, that illegals should be able to hold office and vote.
There's two ways. I would say there's two ways of looking at this, right? One way is we get a country full of people who aren't citizens, who aren't assimilated. The other way of looking at it is, if you are a citizen and you see your country's changing and that the rules are being broken, sort of willy-nilly, it erodes your patriotism or your connection to your community and your country. So it's sort of a a two-pronged problem potentially.
I think it is. And I discuss that in the book, because one of the things that's the cornerstone of citizenship is the symmetry of enforcement of laws, that the wealthy, the poor, everybody has to follow the law. But when you have 550 jurisdictions and you say to the citizen, if you're here illegally and you're convicted and you're going to be released, but it's against the law to have federal immigration people pick you up, and we, the state, in the manner of, say, South Carolina in 1834 or before the Civil War, are going to nullify federal law, then the citizen says, well, that doesn't apply. I can't do that. So what's going to happen, and I think it's already happening in Virginia and 2 counties in Utah, local jurisdictions are saying, I like this Confederate idea of jurisdiction, of nullification. So, within our county, we're not going to obey federal gun registration. So just go into a gun store, buy a gun. State of Utah, the county in Virginia will say it's fine, or the Endangered Species Act. And so there's no end to it. And that's what led to the Civil War. And then that's well aside from the idea that people look at, 100,000 people coming from Afghanistan. They say, this is great, but they don't have a vaccination. So why are they treated differently than I am if I'm a Social Security worker? Or they say the same thing about the southern border. So it's very important that laws apply to everybody. And when you make exemptions and they're not justifiable, then, as you say, and I wrote, that you erode the idea of citizenship and that everybody has to play by the same rules.
And then the final of the three here is tribalism, which I think is very problematic. I think of it in terms of like identity politics. I think unfortunately we've gotten to a point now where, if you tell me your ethnicity, your religion, your sex, your are you cisgendered, trans, whatever, then I can tell you what political party you're in. Like
Yeah.
99% of the time, probably. But talk about that.
Well, I was curious about that because it's explicitly stated in a number of classical texts, say Thucydides, that one of the hallmarks of civilization is that people stop being migratory. They settled in one place with borders, but they also gave up their tribal identity. The whole Athenian democratic experiment was to recreate people of tribes. They would actually relocate their representative districts so they would overlap on tribes. And the word tribus is actually a Latin word meaning three, and it was a reference to a distant, murky time in the past where three tribes ran Rome, and they were destroyed or intermingled or conglomerated into Kiwi citizens. So we know that countries that are tribal, or systems that are tribal, like the Soviet Union had a lot of different tribes, or the Ottomans, they had to have a level of coercion that's antithetical to our own to make it work. Serbia, Croatia, Bosnia, Kosovo, they had to have under Tito. When that left, people had not intermingled, they had not intermarried, they had not, and it blew up. Same thing with Rwanda. But we had sort of had a one tribal system, and that was, although the vast majority of people who settled in North America were white Europeans, but gradually they were like an onion, they were added to. The core was, it was first, then no longer just British, then Irish, then continental, then Jews, and then South Americans, and then people from Asia. Each group facing discrimination, as always happens from the majority culture. And then we had this special case of African Americans and slavery and Jim Crow, but we were dealing with the latter. That was the civil rights movement. And then somewhere, I think 20 years ago, especially during the Obama, we created a new word called diversity. And that meant that for the first time, we were going to divorce historical context and class and just fixate on race. And suddenly, I know people out here, I live in an area where there's a lot of Punjabis, and they would always complain to me. They were very dark, and they came from India. They're very wealthy, but they were not eligible for affirmative action because they didn't qualify as a historically oppressed group that was economically not achieving parity. And then suddenly they felt they were diverse, and they were hired in universities and everything and said, we're diverse. So was my South Korean oral surgeon. So was a person I know from the Basque land. So we kind of created this artificial, and that has nothing to do with oppression or context or class, but everybody wants to get into it. Sometimes to the ridiculous level, like Elizabeth Warren or Ward Churchill or Rachel Dolezal, where they manufacture. Sometimes kids, I know some admissions officers at universities, they'll actually send in their DNA. Sometimes just ridiculous when Oprah at a $90 million Montecito mansion invites Meghan Markle from a $15 million Montecito mansion, and then they get together and they complain about the adversities that they suffer. when class is much more important. I mean, I have a lot of students at Cal State Fresno in the past that were the children of truckers or dysfunctional families in the Sierra foothills, the Oklahoma diaspora of the Okies, the 1930s, and they had nothing. And yet they weren't eligible for anything. So I think if we're going to want to help the impoverished or the underclass, we've got to go back to the idea that class now is a great determinant. I think the left feels they don't want to do that because class is mobile, it's fluid. Yesterday's oppressed can be, but race is a permanent mark on somebody, and you can say
Yeah.
Barack Obama is oppressed, even though he lives in Martha's Vineyard now. He's oppressed. So is LeBron James. They're oppressed. Whereas somebody who's, as I said,
Somebody who's poor today thinks that they're going to be rich tomorrow, and maybe their children will be.
Yeah,
or maybe they will be.
So I think that was one of the things that I thought was dangerous about tribalism. And then the other thing is usually it's like nuclear proliferation. Once one group goes tribal for the very existence, you saw that in Yugoslavia. Once the Serbs started doing that, then the Croats did it, and then the Kosovars, and then the Albanians, et cetera, Bosnians. And once we start to say that our superficial appearance, our religion is our main persona, not incidental, then everybody will start to do that for survival. And as I say, I can already start to see it a little bit. I live in a community that's about 90% Mexican American. But when it's very tribal in the sense that, we have a lot of La Raza stuff. But when I go to Walmart and I see the vestigial middle class of people still here that haven't moved out, and they're not all white, some of them are Asian or of various different ethnic groups, they almost come up and say hello to you. They feel they have a natural solidarity because they're outnumbered and they don't like tribalism, but if they don't like it, they can't stop it. So they want to find their own tribe.
All right. We lost you there for a second.
Yeah. Oh, I hope I'm okay.
I do too. Hope we didn't lose. That was really good stuff. I hope we didn't lose it. Let me let's see. What is your could I get your email address? I might email you a new link.
Okay, it's VH small letters at Stanford STANFORD.edu.
Okay, because I'm not seeing. Yeah,
I can see. I never lost you, but I just saw something that said weekly.
Oh, you didn't? Okay.
No, I never lost.
So let me ask you this: when I'm talking and you're talking, are you seeing like
everything perfectly? In fact, there's no delay at all. There's no delay. I'm looking at your lips are perfect. I mean,
let's keep it going then.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm gonna roll the dice.
Okay.
I'm gonna hope. So you didn't give me you gave me now let me ask you this. Is it okay if I put this on the internet that people have your email address?
On the internet?
Like if I put this on YouTube, if people see this.
Yeah, because you can go to the Stanford website.
Okay.
You can get it anyway.
So if this works out, this whole thing is going to go up. So
okay. Yeah.
My editing skills are limited. All right.
Okay.
So the good thing is, whatever happened, we got through those three, which I think is vital. Let me ask you this. I know you've looked at other countries, and I'm worried that we could be like other countries. However, America is a unique and exceptional nation. And in our own history, we've had, a sort of tribalism. People identified as Virginians or Mississippians or Pennsylvanians, right? And that gave us a civil war, but we did endure. And we've had, immigration. Obviously, we've had situations where I think people used to kind of come and go across the Mexican border.
They did.
So
Absolutely.
What is it about today that is kind of uniquely bad?
Well, I think today is that one thing that is that we're a modern, sophisticated, complex society. So when you talk about people coming across the border, that was pretty much the situation, say, from 1840 to 1910 in the frontier, because it was very sparsely populated and the government was almost non-existent in the American Southwest for much of the 19th century. So people just felt This was a natural freedom, almost as if they were tribal. And so people did go back and forth, not in large numbers though. But people did feel that. But as we started to become more settled in the West, and we started to be more permanent, then people said, we've got to be. It has to be more. It has to be more regulated or more controlled, or we're going to have no. We don't know where America ends or begins. So part of it was population density and the sophistication of life itself. The other was that we started with this, as I said earlier, a binary, and it was largely because we were settled. At least the European population was mostly British speaking, and then each time we had an addition to that original group, there was discrimination, etc. Or the people used to write columns saying, "Are the Irish human?" Remember? And yeah, and then they went after the Germans and Scandinavian, and then it kept assimilating, and it was harder for people who were Asian or Mexican American because they were deemed less close to the original. But we had this Constitution, and this Declaration said all men are equal. So the innate logic of our system was to adopt, recalibrate, and keep the core values, but it didn't really matter what you looked like. And I think we did pretty well until, as we changed the immigration law in 1965, and we sort of said, well, we're going to let people come here on the basis not of skill sets or their knowledge of English or high school diplomas, but just proximity to the border and family ties. We had a huge influx ever since of people who were poor. They did not have the same level of education as in the past. And most importantly, the host had a very different idea of assimilation and the welfare state and the levels of accommodation. They didn't go through the brutal bargain, which said, you chose to come here, we're going to make you an American. But what I mean by that is when I was in school, say 8 years, at 8 years old, in my class, I think there were 4 of us that weren't Mexican American, but the teacher would say, we're all going to speak the King's English. Everybody stand up and say, I can still remember it, I have a stick shift Chevy. Everybody had stick shifts in those days, and everybody would go, I have a stick shift Chevy. No. You're never going to be successful in America. You have to speak better. And that was the idea.
It's so funny you're saying this. I was just listening to Jonah Goldberg interviewing a psychologist who, and they were talking about how babies cry in accents, and babies can detect people who speak a different accent, and sort of positing the theory that a lot of what we call racism isn't based on discriminating against people on how they look, but it's actually how they sound. And that if everyone spoke the Queen's English, for better or worse, then there wouldn't be, the theory at least is that there wouldn't be as much racism.
Yeah, I think so. And I taught 21 years at a very impoverished place, Cal State Fresno, and I taught Greek and Latin. But most of my students were either Southeast Asian, African American, but the majority were Mexican American or Central American. A few poor whites. But in every class, we would have you read the Greek and Latin out loud, translate it out loud, and then give reports with no notes. But part of their grade was the degree to which their English spoken and written was flawless, and the degree to which they could master the English language. And the biggest criticism, unfortunately, came from the La Raza studies, or what it was later Latino studies, because people said that I was culturally appropriating indigenous culture and implanting an artificial culture. But I always made the assumption that my job wasn't to determine why people came here from Vietnam or Laos or Mexico, but they did come here, so they must have voted one way or the other with their feet. And my job was to make sure they had a comparable or a competitive education that would give them a good salary and let them buy a home and get into the middle class as soon as possible. And the best way of doing that, I thought, was education and mastery of language.
The good news is the book is called The Dying Citizen, not the Dead Citizen. So
yes,
presumably we still could address these three things and get our house in order.
I think I'm not going to get political, but for better or for worse, uh, for all Donald Trump's braggadocio about Mexico will pay for the wall and all the lawsuits and all the Sturm and Drang, forget all the back and forth. But there was a point somewhere around November of 2019 where pretty much there was not illegal immigration anymore for a couple of months. And we had solved that problem. And I think the economy, the pre COVID economy, when you had record low Hispanic and African American unemployment and record low peacetime, almost 3.5. So there were mechanisms within the American establishment that really transcended politics. There was a way of doing it, and it was acrimonious, but it was starting to work on that level. The middle class is a little bit more difficult, but there were people of both parties who were saying fair trade, not free trade. China, the more you indulge China, the more liberal it's not going to get. It's going to look at that magnanimity as weakness to be exploited. And the other part, as I said in the book, were these were top down organic natural processes, but I looked at also the administrative state and the evolutionaries that want to change the system, and then globalization. We talked about globalization, but there were also elites that had a hand in deliberately and by intent rather than just laxity that changed, I think, the idea and the performance of citizen.
So that's a perfect tie into I tweeted out that I was going to talk to you, and so I solicited questions
Yeah.
from some people, and this one ties into the you've been critical of elites, including people like General Milley,
Yes.
generals, and so here's a question. Um, as someone who has studied the military, what obligation, if any, does a military leader have to step in if they believe the president is dangerous? If the crisis is real, resigning would seem to be almost cowardly.
Uh, I would disagree with that because if you look at periods where we had real problems between civilians and military, and they usually came from the right. So we had a guy named Edwin Walker, a very talented ground commander, and he was suggesting in the 1960s that JFK and uh, Johnson were treasonous, and he made about Cuban crisis, we sold people out, or the anti-ballistic missile, all that stuff. Or we had Curtis LeMay, who we think as SAC commander was going on unauthorized flights into Soviet territory just to probe their defenses without the knowledge of the president. Or he advocated that after Bay of Pigs, we just start bombing immediately, or that the embargo should shoot back at Soviets. And they were the stuff really in the popular culture that fueled Dr. Strangelove, who basically is a caricature of Curtis LeMay, one of the characters, and 7 Days in May, those types of conspiracy moves. And then we have Douglas MacArthur, and you could argue that he was probably right that China had to be stopped, but the idea that you were going to go up into the Yalu River, where you were right on the border with China. North Korea expands. It gets cold in November when he sold everybody after Incheon on going all the way and reuniting Korea. And then it blew up because 1 million Chinese crossed the border. And then he wanted to use atomic waste or have a regional command. It was kind of lunatic, even though strategically he was very gifted. He had a wonderful record, but he was saying and things that were insurrectionary. And there were mechanisms then to deal with that. And I think a lot of Americans, given that he got a ticker tape parade when he resigned or when he was fired, and Harry Truman left the office with the lowest percentage of popular support, what I'm very in a windy way is disagreeing with the call or the questioner, because in that particular case, the people all thought that MacArthur was right. And he should do something about that because Truman had lost us the Korean War and he's going to lose us the Cold War. And yet we had a system that the Joint Chiefs understood that you cannot question the commander. So as it goes to General Milley, We've had a statute in 1947 and 1953 and 1986, and they all limited the prerogatives and the parameters of the Joint Chiefs. And it was a reaction to World War II when we created them, and they were both advisors to the president, but they were also interfering with the chain of command and sometimes overriding. So we said, you know what? We're going to make the Joint Chiefs purely advisory, and they're going to be honorific, the top people in each of the services, but they're not going to be operational. So when General Milley decides, after talking to the oppositional leader de facto, Nancy Pelosi, that Donald Trump is capable of anything, then he decides, he makes a diagnosis on his own, and he says, you know what? I'm going to interrupt the chain of command. And I'm going to tell the regional commanders, if there's ever an order that touches on nuclear weapons, that has to go through me. That's against the law. Or I'm going to go call my Chinese counterpart and warn him of a preemptive attack. It would be sort of like right now, a more conservative Joint Chiefs called up Kevin McCarthy, or Kevin McCarthy called him when they had the majority and said, you know what? Joe Biden is non compos mentis, in my opinion, and therefore he's going to lose Afghanistan. So I want you to do something. And then this general, a General Milley type of person, would go to people and say, do not obey any orders from Joe Biden, because he's going to lose his Afghanistan, and that could have catastrophic effect. That's insurrection. And so we have, and if you don't like the president, we have a lot of things you can do about it. You can impeach him, and we impeached him twice. You can convict him in the Senate. They didn't pull that off. You can invoke the 25th Amendment. People thought about that and almost tried it against Trump. I don't know if they're going to do it with Biden. You might be more successful with Biden if you gave him the Montreal cognitive assessment that they gave Trump. But you have means to do that, or you can resign. You can say, you know what, I'm going to give a press conference and resign. We don't need to have that subversion. We have a uniform code of military justice as well, that after World War II, when we had all of this freelancing with a 12 million person army, we said, you know what, guys in the Air Force, they're AWOL and they get a week punishment, and a guy in the Navy is in the brig for a year. Let's make it uniform, and let's get these retired generals to shut the blank up. They're criticizing us. So we had it. Article 88 says no retired general who's subject to recall or on a pension shall disparage a commander in chief. So what happened? The law is designed to protect the worst case scenario. It's not to protect a beloved JFK or Ronald Reagan. It's to protect us from abusing the system when Donald Trump is there, or maybe Joe Biden now, who's going to be about equally unpopular. And so what happened, as soon as Donald Trump supposedly said he used tear gas at Lafayette Square and had a photo op, which the Inspector General of the Department of Interior says now was not true, General Mattis said, I quit. He's using Nazi-like tactics. And then General McCaffrey, he's a retired, very esteemed general, said he's Mussolini. He canceled a New York Times script. And then Admiral McRaven wrote an op-ed, said he should leave sooner than later. Then Rosa Brooks, remember, 10 days into the Trump first term and only term, she said that, if you can't get rid of him by the 25th Amendment or impeachment, then you should think about a military coup. So we're in a very dangerous point now where the military has been very politically active. And the left always played a valuable role, because we on the conservative side support the CIA, the FBI, the military. And the left said, no, not so fast. They get into revolving door situations. They go for Northrop, Lockheed, Raytheon, and they go right back with military industrial complex. But now the left is saying, we like these guys. Subsidized transgendered surgeries in the military, women in combat, pregnant flight suits. This is what we want. No back and forth. They can just do it, and we'll just give them a pass. So if General Austin comes from Raytheon and he goes back to Raytheon, we don't care. They're on our side. So the military is becoming very politicized, and I think it's lost. You can see it in the polls. It's lost its preeminent position. I think that's dangerous.
All right, two more, and we'll call it a day. And Lord willing, we will have captured all of this, this conversation. Next question. this is your last book about
Yeah.
Trump. Your book about Trump held that Trump was the Western anti-hero necessary to clean up the town despite his flaws. Do you still believe that? Trump's COVID-19 response seemed ready-made for a take-charge hero from the no-bullshit business world, and yet Trump was totally unable to handle it from even a basic level.
Well, I would disagree with the last. If you look at Joe Biden said that. He also said that nobody had been vaccinated until he became president. He said that he was the architect of the vaccination program. But if you look at the people who've died per day since the COVID outbreak, on whose watch, I think we're at the point now where more people have died during Joe Biden's. We went from about 300,000 to 730,000, and we did that not over about a year, but we did that in the first 9 months. So I don't really think you blame a president necessarily of either party for the number of deaths in COVID. I do think that Donald Trump did some good things, and that was he discussed moral hazard with these companies like Moderna and Pfizer, and we got a very effective vaccine out to the people, and he waived liabilities for things like Regeneron and monoclonal antibodies, so we had therapeutics as well. I think his mistake was that, and I think Anthony Fauci was a distinguished servant, but Anthony Fauci had said masks don't work. And then he said one mask works. Then he said, why not two? He said herd immunity was 60, 70, 80. No, it requires 90. No, I had no role in gain of function. It's not gain of function. The Wuhan vibe had no, and that. So he had somebody that was ideologically opposed to him. And I think he could have put what he did. Donald Trump got mad, but he didn't get even. What he should have done was put his arm around Fauci and said, sincerely, this is a very distinguished public servant. He's had 40 years at the helm, and I'm going to miss him because he's retiring tomorrow. And then I think he would have had a team that was more coherent. But as far as the larger question of was he anti-hero, that touches on what's his role now. And there were people that called journalists and historians, and a couple of people from the White House at the highest level said, called me about that after the election. And I said, Donald Trump did a number of wonderful things. If you look at the economy and unemployment, and we're now the world's largest natural gas and oil producer, gas prices are lower, conservative traditionalist court. We reestablished deterrence with North Korea. We told the Soviets, if you attack our base, we're going to kill you. We took out Baghdadi and so many, and we didn't get into a large conventional preemptive war as we had done in the past. So there were a lot of good things, but Donald Trump's tweets or his demeanor kind of negated the credit he got. And so I said, if you look at Shane, Magnificent Seven, High Noon, even the Wild Bunch, people like effectiveness, and then when the effectiveness takes in, they have the luxury or laxity to look at the mechanisms, and they got tired of the mechanisms. So Joe Biden kind of had a non-campaign. William McKinley liked him his cabin, porch, and he said, "I don't tweet. I'll bring us together." And a lot of people had suspicions about the hard left AOC Elizabeth Warren agenda, but they bought that. And so now the question is, most people, if you look at the polls, like the agenda, but they don't know whether they're really confused. So a guy like Ron DeSantis, to take one example, he seems sober and judicious. He'd be a good emissary. He's on the agenda. He's very suspicious of illegal immigration. He wants to get tough with China. He does not want optional wars in the Middle East. He wants to pump more natural gas and oil. However, is he able to take on the left? Can he have a rally of 40,000 people? So they don't know. They don't know. My suspicion is that Trump, for his own good, after the election, should have gone down to Georgia and should have campaigned, because the left had two charismatic socialists and the right had two very uncharismatic conservatives. And they were going to lose that. And he didn't do that. He talked about the election ad nauseum. And then he could have, as a tragic hero, campaigned all during this year for these House representatives. And then he could have gravitated to a senior spokesman, controversial, but take credit and then pass the baton. And we'll see if that happens, because he's going to be 78. And I think after Joe Biden's first 9 months, there's going to be a lot of people in both parties that say, it's very rare for a 78-year-old to be able to withstand the rigors of this type of job. So we'll see. But I think that I still believe he did a lot of things that he won't get credit for. Remember, a tragic hero never gets credit. Everybody despises him. And then years later, somebody says, oh, by the way, there was little immigration. Wow, I didn't know we were the first time in history you're energy self-sufficient. Or wow, look at those judges. Who got them? I don't remember that.
I'm sure there'll be a strange new respect, and it'll be the good old days of Trump, but the new guy, new guy's a fascist.
They
Let me
always
ask
do
you,
that.
in 2024, would you rather see like a DeSantis or a Cotton, or would you rather have Trump? Would you vote? Say there's a primary. Would you rather vote for Trump or one of the other guys?
I have an open mind. You remember, and the reason I do is I'm not trying to evade your question, but you remember in 2000, I didn't vote for Trump in the primaries, but I really liked the idea that Scott Walker was a hands-on guy. He's kind of like DeSantis is now. He was in a purple state. He knew how to deal with the hardcore unions, but yet he wasn't alienating. He was a professional, and everybody said he was the ideal candidate. They said the same thing about Jeb Bush, but once he got on the stage, he could not answer on his feet effectively, and he eroded. He had a lot of great advisors. He had money. So did Jeb Bush. So you never know what's going to happen. And then I thought Trump is going to be, I'll never forget it. I thought Trump can't do this. Come on. But the first question was I don't remember, Rand Paul went after Trump. And he said, you are the type of guy that ruins politics. You pour your money in, and then you want quid pro quos. And that's why you shouldn't be president. And Trump didn't bat an eye, and he said, I am. Everything you say is true. And that's why when you came up to my office and you begged me for $10,000, I wrote you a check. And you so far, you've done pretty well for me. So that I thought, wow, this is kind of like chemotherapy. And if he's a nominee, I'll probably vote for him, because the cancer is there, and he will kill the cancer a day before he kills us.
All right, last question. Ask him if he thinks our nation would be stronger if our government finished defining what it means to be a citizen during Reconstruction, to attach responsibilities to the rights our founders gave us.
I didn't hear that part. During Reconstruction?
Yeah, let me read it again.
Yeah.
Ask him if he thinks our nation would be stronger if our government finished defining what it means to be a citizen during Reconstruction, to attach responsibilities to the rights our founders gave us.
Yeah, I think Grant, for example, is going under enormous reconsideration and reevaluation. He had people around him were corrupt, and it was not a very successful 8 years. But one thing that he did do is he kept troops in the South, and he was transitioning to a normal situation. By normal, I mean it's abnormal to have you can't disenfranchise 70% of the population, the white, and then have only African American Reconstruction senators. On the other hand, you have to have some that represent their position in the population. And yet we went from all black legislatures in the South to all white without batting an eye. Once that corrupt bargain of 1876 took place, where we gave a candidate the presidency on the condition that the Democrats would demanded out of the Republicans, would pull out federal troops. So yeah, I think if we had federal troops there another 15 years, got to remember that the Ku Klux Klan as we know it today is a second or third manifestation. We destroyed Nathan Bedford Forrest's Ku Klux Klan. I mean, whether it was good or whether the mechanisms were legal, but I mean, we declared an end to habeas corpus in Tennessee and rounded up every Klan member and jailed them. And they didn't exist. They came back in the 1910s and 20s, and they were more anti-Catholic, they were anti-everything. But I think had we stuck with Reconstruction, it would have naturally not offended so many people. It was kind of brutal the first 3 years, but it was starting to kick in, and I think that was a terrible mistake. If we'd kept it 20 more years, I think we would have avoided a lot of the problems we had now. I also think that There were people within the South that we really deprecated in the 1960s, looking back, like Booker T. Washington. We sort of called him an Uncle Tom. George Washington Carver. These were very gifted people that grew up in horrendous circumstances, and they were sort of saying that we on our own have achieved parity, and so trust us, this whole African American experience will start to resemble what we've done if you'll just stay here and give us equal opportunity. And there was no talk at that time of a quality result. It was equal opportunity. So yeah, I think that was a big mistake.
All right, everybody. The book is called The Dying Citizen. Everybody go get it. Victor Davis Hanson, thank you for coming back on the news.
Well, thank you for having me again. I appreciate it.